2025 was never going to be an ordinary year for Nintendo. After nearly a decade defined by the success of the original Nintendo Switch, this was the moment when everything had to shift forward without losing what the company had so widely trusted. Nintendo was asking players to believe that the next era would feel familiar without feeling stale, and that balancing act shaped almost every decision Nintendo made this year, and it's why Nintendo's 2025 feels both reassuring and very restrained at the same time. Well, today I'm going to go through Nintendo's 2025, and I'm going to give Nintendo a grade on exactly how they did. Well, if you like this video, then subscribe for more Nintendo content here on Power Up Direct. So 2025 was a year that demanded confidence from Nintendo. The Switch had rewritten the rules of modern console success, and following that kind of cultural and commercial impact, it's a challenge that very few companies ever have to face. Nintendo approached 2025 carefully, making choices that protected their legacy whilst cautiously opening the door to what comes next. And that caution defines both the year's greatest strengths and also its most visible weaknesses. Well, first up, let's have a look at the Switch 2. So, the launch of the Switch 2 was the single most important event in Nintendo's 2025 calendar. In many ways, it delivered exactly what was needed. The system did not chase raw power or attempt to compete directly with the most advanced hardware on the market. Instead, Nintendo focused on removing the friction that had slowly accumulated over the original Switch's lifespan. Games loaded faster, ran more consistently, and looked cleaner, creating an experience that felt smoother without fundamentally changing how people played. What mattered just as much as the technical improvements was how clearly Nintendo communicated the Switch 2 system identity. There was no confusion about what the Switch 2 was or who it was for. It was positioned as Nintendo's next generation console, but still respected the habits that players had built over the years. Backward compatibility reinforced that message, allowing the players to carry forward their libraries and preventing the new system from feeling like a reset. The Switch 2 modernised Nintendo's hardware philosophy exactly at the right moment. Well, next up, let's have a look at Nintendo's software in 2025. So Nintendo's first-party games in 2025 reflected a company deeply confident in its production values, but equally cautious about any experimentation. At a time when much of the industry has struggled with unfinished launches and post-release damage control, Nintendo continued to release games that felt complete, stable, and thoughtfully designed. And even when players disagreed with some of the creative decisions, the craftsmanship behind those games was rarely in question. Just look at the polish and the finish on Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza, and even Kirby Air Riders. Now, I didn't personally enjoy Kirby Air Riders, but the polish and the finish on that game, truly is second to none. Players knew what to expect when a Nintendo game launched, and that trust has real value in an increasingly unstable industry. However, that same consistency that protected Nintendo from major missteps also limited moments of surprise. The games were polished and dependable, but they rarely felt daring. In 2025, Nintendo chose refinement over reinvention. They kept their standards high, but also left some players wanting more ambition from a new generation. Well, next up, let's have a look at the Switch 2's launch lineup. So the early months of the Switch 2's life highlighted Nintendo's cautious approach more clearly than any other part of the year. While the launch lineup offered a solid experience and it benefited from improved hardware performance, it lacked a singular statement piece or game that defined that console's identity. There was no immediate sense that this was a generation that could only exist on the Switch 2, and for longtime fans, that absence certainly was noticeable. I do think Nintendo would have benefited from Donkey Kong Bonanza being a launch title rather than fans having to wait 6 to 8 weeks after launch. Mario Kart World fell flat, and Donkey Kong Bonanza could have been that title to really cement Nintendo's ambitions. Nintendo's strategy seemed designed to ease players into the transition rather than push them forward abruptly. That approach worked well for some newcomers and casual players, but for those eager to see Nintendo fully embrace the potential of its new hardware, the launch period felt quite restrained. It wasn't a failure, but it was undeniably conservative, and it framed the Switch 2's early months as a foundation rather than a celebration. Well, next up, let's have a look at Nintendo's online services. So despite the opportunity presented by the new hardware, Nintendo's online infrastructure in 2025 remained one of the company's most persistent shortcomings. While performance improvements benefited online play in practical ways, the surrounding systems felt outdated and awkward compared to industry standards. Basic features like communication, social interaction, and user-friendly matchmaking continue to feel unnecessarily complicated. Drag and Drive is a really good example of this. You can play online with friends, but even when you get into a lobby, it puts you into random teams. It is very frustrating and just feels like an own goal that Nintendo could have avoided. Now, what makes this particularly disappointing was the sense that these issues are no longer transitional growing pains. By 2025, Nintendo have got years of feedback and experience to draw from, and the Switch 2 represented a chance to rethink its approach entirely. Instead, Nintendo largely carried existing systems forward, reinforcing the idea that online services remain a low priority for the company, even as online play becomes even more central to modern gaming on other platforms like PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and also other platforms too. Well, next up we've got communication. So Nintendo has always preferred controlled communication, but in 2025 that approach sometimes worked against them. Between major announcements there were long stretches of silence. It created uncertainty rather than anticipation. This silence was especially noticeable during a generational transition, and clarity can help maintain momentum. Nintendo didn't need to provide detailed roadmaps or consistent updates, but the lack of consistent communication made parts of the year feel quieter than they really needed to be. The confidence was there, but it wasn't always clearly shared. Well, next up we've got brand strength. So even with the missteps, Nintendo's cultural position in 2025 remained incredibly strong. Its core franchises continue to resonate across generations, and the company's identity felt more secure than ever. Nintendo didn't need to prove its relevance, it already had it. That strength gave the company freedom, but it also has encouraged caution. Rather than pushing aggressively into new creative territory, Nintendo often relied on the enduring appeal of what already worked. This wasn't a sign of stagnation. This isn't necessarily a sign of stagnation, but it does suggest a company comfortable protecting its position rather than pushing the boundaries and moving forward or challenging that comfort. So with the final assessment, I would say it's a strong year but carefully played. Nintendo's 2025 was not defined by failure or disappointment, it was defined by careful progress. The Switch 2 provided a strong foundation, the software maintained high standards, and the company avoided the kind of missteps that had damaged others in the industry. This definitely wasn't the launch of the Wii U. Nintendo have seen record-breaking numbers for the Switch 2, and they have set up a strong position going into 2026. At the same time, caution limited that sense of excitement that often defines the start of a new generation. This was not a year of bold statements, it was a year of preparation for the future. Nintendo have shown that it still knows how to lead, but it also showed that it prefers to move slowly when it's already ahead. So what matters now is what comes next, and that is 2026. I think there is plenty to look forward to in 2026. I've got a lot of anticipation for next year. So this is one of the most exciting times to be a Nintendo fan at the beginning of a new console generation. We've got big new franchises coming, a new Zelda, a new Mario, a new Animal Crossing, loads of things to be really excited about. Well, that is it for this video today, and thank you so much for watching or for listening. And don't forget, you can hit that subscribe button down below for even more Nintendo content here on Power Up Direct. Thanks again, and I'll see you real soon.